read the article.
Good. Okay, we're live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these discussions. And today we're talking about the subject of Alaska. And some of us read an article from the Anchorage Daily News entitled The Trade-Offs of a Fat Permanent Fund Dividend. So there's been some politicking going on lately where the amount of the dividend has been less than it normally would be for the past few years, and they kind of want to make up for that. Anyway, there's the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend, which is largely funded by oil, is something that's often compared to basic income. So the question I want to start with for people is, in what ways do you think it's appropriate to compare the Alaska program with a true universal basic income? What are the similarities? What are the differences? So Bethany, do you want to start us off?
I think some of the similarities are that it's unconditional money, so you can see what people do with a little bit more freedom, whether they move around, spend differently, those kinds of things.
Sure.
Another thing that I think is highly applicable is the way that he described it went from controversial to accepted, and almost people would probably be quite upset if it went away at this point. So like the politics around new government spending often are like that. And it's like, for example, Social Security or anything else. And it seems like this followed that pattern. And I suspect that an actual or a larger basic income that was nationwide would probably follow the same pattern. Would be controversial, and then not after not that long would be like expected, and people would be upset if it would go away. Ways in which it's not, I mean, it's clearly much smaller. It's too small for most people to live on, so it's not really providing a ton of bargaining power in the workplace or changing the macroeconomy that much, even of the state, probably the same way that a larger basic income would. And then it's limited to one state instead of like a whole bigger chunk of an economy, like a country or the world. So a lot of differences too.
Richard, what do you think are some of the ways in which the Alaska program is comparable or useful to learn from for a basic income?
It's about the same amount that the Finland basic income, if you want to call it that, was comparable to, which was 678 euros or something like that, I believe.
Per month, though, right?
Yeah, per month.
Okay.
Well, that's what it is for this year, and it's 5,000 something or other.
Right, because it's bigger this year than normal.
And for the next 2 or 3 years, I think it is, because they're breaking up for the previous governors slashing it.
Yeah, I think they're just for 2019 they're making it up all at once, and then they're going back to the normal.
And they said in a few years from now it'll be permanently that much because
it keeps growing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying that the amount is getting closer to being comparable to some of the basic income numbers that people talk about.
It'll be about half of what a basic income would be.
Yeah. Sultan, do you have any thoughts about Alaska? Okay. So I think these are good points. I think some important differences between the Alaska program and a basic income is, or one important difference is that the amount of the Alaska dividend is variable from year to year. And as we've seen in the past few years, it kind of depends on politics, and it's been reduced for the past few years. But even when it's not depending on politics, they use a formula to kind of calculate the amount based on how much is in the endowment and stuff like that. So it's not, as Mitchell is saying in the live stream, it's dependent on one source, oil. So the way in which it's funded is they've kind of, it's essentially a sovereign wealth fund, which we've talked about before. But it's funded by oil revenue, and then they invest that revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And it's less about, when I think about basic income, I think about, well, what can the economy handle? And with the Alaska dividend, it's less about, how much consumer spending can the economy respond to, and it's more about, how much revenue can we collect from oil sales and investments based on that to pay out to people. So I think that's an important difference in thinking about what makes it possible. What makes the Alaska dividend possible is that the state of Alaska is selling oil, and then it's able to distribute some of that revenue among its citizens, or some of the invested revenue. And what makes basic income possible in the broad scheme of things, especially once you get to a really large scale, is how much consumer spending is possible in the economy. So it's kind of two different. It's very so in terms of what people get, it's kind of like a similar thing. Everybody's getting free money, but in terms of how to think about the economics of it, it's kind of like a polar opposite, I'd say.
That makes sense. But I was trying to kind of separate the question you asked at the beginning from like your view of the economics of basic income. Because for example,
Sure.
someone like Andrew Yang might think of it like kind of similarly, or a lot of people that are trying to fund even a national basic income might not limit it to oil, but they would see it as something that like has to come from the profits of the country in a very direct kind of way, and they might either tie it to investments or tie it to taxes or whatever.
Right. Yeah, Richard.
Elizabeth Warren floated a wealth tax, which people would have to sell off. The way you would pay for it is that create a sovereign wealth fund would be people would have to sell off some of their shares of stock or whatever to pay off the wealth tax, and so you would be able to buy cheaper shares of stock from people selling it off.
Right. If everybody's selling, that drives down the price of the stock. Yeah. Which that can come up. That can lead to various complications as well. Like, if everybody's expecting the stock market to go up, and then we kind of change the regulations surrounding it.
Yeah, like there's before these companies what is it? These mutual funds started making rules. Not sorry, mutual funds.
Index funds?
No.
Hedge funds?
No.
Sorry, I list a bunch of funds.
Like
sorry, Richard.
They had to pay buy certain shares of stock by a certain date. The mutual funds would wait for them to buy these shares right before they bought these shares, and so they would make money from them, and then they sell them off right away.
Yeah, anytime you know when something's going to happen in the market, and certain people are restricted, then the people who aren't restricted, can profit from that knowledge. So there's always these side effects that we kind of have to be aware of in the economy. Yeah. So in terms of a wealth tax, I would say that is somewhat similar in thinking about how to fund a basic income to this, because it's like, where do you get the money from?
And Norway also has a sovereign wealth fund. It's up to $2 trillion, I believe now, and that's how they're generously funding their welfare state.
Yep. So and this is true across a lot of the oil countries. So Saudi Arabia, very similar. I think Iran, is another perfect example. They had something very similar to a basic income for a number of years. That was, they got the money by saying, well, instead of subsidizing oil, we want to use that gain to distribute it to the people.
And the eastern band of Cherokee's casinos.
Do they have oil?
No, they use their casino profits.
Right.
But similar idea.
It's a similar idea, and it's kind of this same question over and over again. And a question we can ask in Alaska is, you've got this money from the oil. If you're really limiting, I mean, Alaska can't print money, right? So they have to get money from somewhere. And if you have some money from oil, what's the best way to use that money for the benefit of your people? Is it to give it money to everyone equally, or are there better uses of it? And these are the kinds of questions that come up with basic income a lot. And I don't think. I think if you're thinking in that way, then there's a lot of compelling arguments for why basic income isn't the best option. If you have money, what do you do with it? Do you just hand it out to people, or do you find really impactful ways to spend it? And when I think about basic income, it's about what makes it possible for me in my mind, and what makes it really simple is that you don't have to take money from anything else in order to get consumer spending to the highest level possible. You don't have to take money from someone in order to give it to someone else, or take money from some program in order to fund another program. So the trade-offs here in the Alaska program are more complicated than what you would have when figuring out how to implement a national level basic income.
It's interesting that it seemed to be motivated by something other than like the best social welfare use of the money.
Right.
I didn't totally follow that they wanted people to be in favor of the permanent fund. But why was that a concern, or what exactly is the permanent fund other than this dividend?
So the permanent fund is sovereign. So we should talk about this. Yeah, the permanent fund is the sovereign wealth fund that Alaska set up in the 1970s when it discovered oil on its northern slope, and they suddenly had all these oil revenues, and they wanted to invest it in the future of
the state.
For future Alaskans' benefit. They wanted to invest it. And the dividend didn't come until maybe 7 or 8 years later, in 1982, when they decided to start spending some of this money from the endowment every year and distributing it evenly to people. And there was, I guess, this belief that the permanent fund was a really good investment for the future of Alaska, and they wanted people to be generally in favor of the permanent fund. So if you give them a kind of direct benefit from that, then people are going to be supportive of it. So I think that was kind of the motivation around it.
And why would people not have been supportive of it?
Well, if it's just this abstract thing that they're investing in for the future of Alaskans, that doesn't hit your wallet right now. It doesn't affect your life right now.
And they feel like they'd rather have that money spent now or something like that.
Sure, like maybe they'd rather the oil money goes directly into the state budget and they see the benefits today.
And that's what they did for the past few years, because they had a deficit, and they had to, since they're not a country, they had to pay off the deficit.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, like there's still this kind of political, especially in the past few years, this political push to say like, hey, wait a minute, we've got things we need to accomplish as the state, and we're handing out this free money. Maybe it makes sense to be more fiscally responsible and pay for important stuff for people.
It's an interesting concept, like independent of kind of thinking of it as a basic income. It's an interesting concept to kind of invest the public in something as a way to try to incentivize them to support it. Like I could imagine there might be other applications to that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like what you were saying before with, once people saw it as an entitlement, it's hard to take away.
Yeah.
And even though they tried to kind of take away a portion of it.
It's like the third rail is to kind of, if you do anything to it, you get political backlash. That's what happened 3 weeks before the election when the previous governor dropped out of the race.
In Alaska. Yeah, I think for people in Alaska, it's very much the way most people in America feel about Social Security. Like you can't touch it, and I wonder if we'd see kind of a similar effect with an actual basic income.
I was just thinking you would see a stronger effect because everybody gets it right now. Like a lot of young people aren't sure if they're going to get Social Security eventually, and so it's not. But like this is something that every adult gets, and so everybody has a stake.
There's actually a bill right now where they would tax everyone who works a Social Security tax. So that would be able to pay for Social Security for future generations.
Don't people already pay a Social Security tax?
No, not people over $250,000, I believe it is.
Oh, like an additional one?
They don't have to pay it at all over that amount.
Right, but they're also not getting any more benefit after that amount, because it's like the way it's set up is that you pay in a certain amount and then you kind of like get that amount back prorated at the end of your life. So you're not going to with Social Security, once you're above a certain income threshold, you're not going to be able to accumulate more into your Social Security payout that you would get at the end. But you're suggesting that they have a tax
I'm not suggesting they actually have a bill there, but they're not going to put it through the Senate because of it's Republicans.
Right, but the proposal is that you would have a tax on the incomes over $250,000, and instead of that going to those people who paid in, it would go to other people in the system or something like that. Yeah, so that's interesting. And it's funny how, like we try to shuffle around the numbers just the way Alaska is doing, and we try to do that at the federal level when we really don't have to. I think we spend a lot of energy trying to figure out where money's going to come from and how to fund individual programs and stuff like that. But the reality is that if you pay people, I think we've talked about this before, but if you pay people, their Social Security and the economy, doesn't have the capacity to respond to that spending, then, it's not going to help. The fact that you raised a lot of money is not going to help. And, if the economy has the room, like the fact that you didn't raise a lot of money doesn't mean you can't pay people. So I think there's a lot of kind of conceptual reframing that we need to do to get from what Alaska's program looks like to what people normally think of as a basic income to what actually makes a basic income possible. Yeah. You guys ready for some quotes from the article?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So here's the first one. The more we spend on, so this is kind of what we were talking about. The more we spend on the permanent fund dividend, the less money we have for public services like schools and public safety. If we pay out an additional $1 billion in a year in PFDs, permanent fund dividends, it means there's that much less for services and things like the $2 billion backlog on deferred maintenance of public buildings, or a state capital budget to repair roofs on schools, or build docks and roads to foster economic development. So, I mean, this is, they have some real trade-offs here, and it's not, I don't think we could sit down and like reason out whether it's better to have a permanent fund dividend or better to pay for some of these other important things that their economy needs.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I was wondering if you had any additional information about that would weigh in on this question, because from this article it wasn't really clear.
Well, I mean, I still think it does make a difference to for people to have spending money and to ensure that as the government. But it gets a lot harder to justify when you have buildings that need to be maintained and other infrastructure and stuff. So I think you have all this infrastructure that's important for your citizens, and then one of those pieces of infrastructure is an income. They need spending money in order to participate in the economy.
And also, to ship things up to Alaska, it costs a significant amount more than it would to around the continental U.S., so a basic income would be necessary to offset some of that, I would think.
I was wondering what the cost of living was up there.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess they do import a lot of stuff. I don't know to what extent, or I don't know how much stuff they produce domestically.
Right.
But it's there's also the question of we live in a free travel, open borders country where you can move from state to state freely. So should we, if one state is harder to live in, should we compensate people for that? That's hard to say. Yeah.
You were asking the question from the point of view of Alaska, right? Like the Alaskan state cares about the Alaskans, so they're trying
the Alaskan state cares about the Alaskans. So then the question is, how do you allocate the money among the various infrastructure needs that you have? And I feel like no matter how you allocate it, not all of them are going to get met. Even if your economy has the capacity to build all the roofs and everything like that, if you don't have the money to pay for it, then you've got a problem. So I think what's going to have to end up happening in Alaska, and this is maybe already kind of where they've settled, is that they have all these different programs, including the dividend, and none of them are quite as high as you would want them to be. and they're just kind of making these trade-offs and balancing between them.
I would be really interested to know like effects on things like hospitalizations and other kinds of expensive things related to homelessness, or like homeless people not having food. Like the effects on the lowest income people would be really interesting for me to know, because it is that level of, like, even this relatively small amount of kind of a basic income could have a big influence on somebody who otherwise has no income.
Yeah. So then the question would be, if you do have a limited amount of money, should you really be giving it to everyone, or does it make more sense to give more money to the lower income people?
Right.
With a basic income, as we normally think about it here, giving money to rich people does not prevent us from giving money to poor people. But here you've got a finite amount of money that you're able to hand out. Yeah.
Or they could do what we've talked about, which is give it to everyone so there's not a stigma, but then compensate in taxes, which is something he was a little bit talking about in the article.
Yep.
Well, he didn't talk about it exactly that way, but he talked about taxes going up. So
he talked about exactly that. He talked about clawing back some through an income tax.
Yeah, I guess he did. Yeah. So that would make more sense to me in a way, because then you don't have like this, like the tax system is already kind of set up for all these different gradations, and also then you don't have the stigma attached.
So you can do all the complicated stuff on the taxation side and keep the concern separate of providing the universal dividend to everyone. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it would probably keep the popularity of the fund, because people wouldn't necessarily be able to know whether taking the fund away would lower their taxes, so they would probably still like the fund if that was funding their basic income.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. So here's a question. This is a check that comes once a year. Do we think Alaskans would be better off if it came once a month, or if it got added to their account balance every day, or something
100%.
like that?
100%.
Yeah, 100%. Why 100%?
Well, okay. Let me give some pros and cons, because that's more intelligent than saying 100%. But the pros are, like, I was thinking about the people who were homeless, and I was thinking like $3,000 a year is enough to buy food. But then I was thinking the fact that they get it that people get it in a lump sum, like there are all sorts of problems I could see with that. One is just mismanagement of the money, but which any of us could do. I'm not singling out a particular person, but all of us are more likely to mismanage money if we really need that money and it's given to us all at once. And another is like extortion, or people being vulnerable to other people trying to take their money. If like you're in an abusive relationship, or like you have some other problem with your own autonomy being compromised, or someone wants to steal from you, like if you get a lump sum all at once, they can like target you at that time, make sure to take it. If you're kind of like constantly getting money, it seems a little more secure. So if you're really relying on it for like food and stuff, it's just much, much harder to do. You have to be able to store it somewhere, reliably. I guess you could have a bank account, but like, it's just, it seems a little bit more dicey.
They're trying to do it with the earned income tax credit in Chicago, where they send it out per month. And that, like, if you hand it out at the end of the year, people will build up debts during the year, and it would cost them to pay off the debts with the interest or whatever. But if you hand it out per month, most people don't have $500 to pay off an auto loan or whatever, and so they would actually have say $500, and so they wouldn't have to go in debt in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So expenses cost more if you have to go into debt to pay them. So like, the sooner you have the money, the better. I think the biggest factor is like that, and people, just overspending and then not having money later, which is just such a common thing. I think the thing about being stolen from is more like a rare thing, but I think it might still be important.
Right. What about the argument that when you have a lot of money all at once, that allows you to make a bigger decision or a bigger investment, or
like the merry-go-round fund in Kenya with give directly.
So that was kind of I meant to go to the other side. That was going to be my point on the other side. I mean, theoretically, you could save it, but it's the same kind of behavioral problem as in the other direction, where you might not actually do that, and then you never kind of build up a large amount.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like saving for you. You could think of it as.
Right.
And I guess that could have advantages. My gut intuition is like that's going to make more of a difference for the people who already have like at least some money. Whereas in terms of just like getting people food every day, I'd be more worried about the opposite problem.
Okay.
Because like a big purchase is by its very nature like a secondary concern above and beyond food every day for most people. Because you need the food every day to live. So, but Depending on how many people are in each category.
Yeah. So why do we think that they pay out this check once a year and not once a month?
Because they don't know how much they're going to get from oil revenues for an entire year.
But they can't calculate that on a monthly basis?
Because oil fluctuates, but from like day to day.
Yeah, but I mean, the way they pay out the check now is they take an average over the past 5 years or something like that to, calculate the amount of the dividend. So why wouldn't they just? I don't understand why they
Sometimes
couldn't.
oil is $140 a barrel, and other times it goes down to $30 a barrel.
Right.
So, and that can happen like on a daily basis.
Well, I mean, that's why you take an average, right? So the question is, why can't they, take an average of the price of oil over the last 5 years every month, and then divide the amount by 12 or something like that? Or if they are calculating the amount at the end of the year every year, why don't they just divide that number by 12 and hand it to people in monthly installments, and then the next year, hand it to people in monthly installments again?
One possible reason is it's just easier administratively, or it just got set up that way because tax refunds and other things are a once a year thing.
Yeah.
Another possibility is that it's better for them politically because it's more noticeable to get a check for $3,000 than it is to get a little bit of, possibly more noticeable than to get a little bit of money every month. Maybe not, maybe yes.
More popular if it's a bigger number?
Could be, or however it seems bigger. Hard to say. I mean, that's definitely true at a certain amount, like 1 cent, a month doesn't matter to anybody, but
12 cents a year matters?
Well, that wasn't the best example. They've done studies on this kind of thing, like dividing it up versus not, and it kind of depends on the amount and stuff, which makes a bigger impact. And I don't know exactly if that had anything to do
like
with it.
in Wisconsin, they had this Governor Walker, who was just voted out, had this wanted to have a like a check handed out right before the election so that he would be more popular going into the election. So it could be something like that too.
Oh, is it time near the elections?
This one is, I think it says December that they would receive it, so it's not that, but it could potentially be that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that's like, presidents requesting from, the Federal Reserve that they don't raise interest rates right before the election and stuff like that.
Right.
I think that's
Politics,
yeah. So let's go to another quote. Here we go. So this is related to what we were talking about before. Most of us now recognize that Alaskans now look at the permanent fund dividend as an entitlement. But it's interesting to recall that the dividend was actually controversial when it was adopted in the early 1980s. Alaskans were very conservative then, and many opposed the state handing out checks. In fact, it narrowly passed the legislature. So this kind of gives me hope for basic income, and I think this very much parallels, the process that they went through, when first instituting Social Security in this country.
And also, basic income in the early 1970s, it passed the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate because they didn't think it was high enough. So if you think it's not going to pass it, if it can barely pass in the state, you might be able to barely pass in the nationally as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I can imagine a scenario in which basic income is very controversial among everyone right up until the moment it actually gets implemented. And then it gets implemented, and then nobody wants it to be taken away at all. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder if it's one of those things, like someone like Andrew Yang gets to be president, and everyone's divided on it, and then maybe he makes it happen or convinces Congress to pass like his version of basic income, and then you have something there, and it can't be taken away. And I think that would be a good thing.
I think that's my guess too. I guess I would just point out that in the Alaska case specifically, it's not obvious to me. until we figured out this other calculus, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Because one thing that could happen is like people get attached to it, and then they also don't want taxes raised, and so what happens is like social programs or other things that are really needed get cut when they're trying to kind of balance the budget. Like if it wasn't the best use of funds, right?
Yeah, I mean, or the deficit increases.
No, in a state, in Alaska. They
Oh,
can.
in Alaska. Yeah.
I'm talking about Alaska specifically. Like, it can also work against you if it wasn't the best or it doesn't remain the best kind of way to handle the welfare in the state or well-being in the state.
Yeah, but do you think the collective populace is able to make that calculation about whether it's better than the alternative? Like they see it in their wallet, but are they calculating bridges and roads and schools?
No, that's my whole point.
Yeah.
So even if the money would be better used on bridges and schools and stuff,
right, they wouldn't.
They won't be able to actually do that politically because people don't want to let go of their income.
Right.
So that's a downside to people getting attached to it, which is what I think would happen. Like I think, and at the state level, it's not obvious whether that's a good or a bad thing. That's all I'm saying.
I think you're probably right about that. So then it's, I can imagine why some people would be afraid of basic income at the national level if they're thinking of it in similar ways.
Yeah.
Like we put this thing in place and now we can't get rid of it and it's preventing us from, other important spending, that kind of thing.
Well, I'm not a Republican, but I think this is like a classic concern among conservatives or Republicans about social programs in general, is that like you kind of build up a government more easily than you shrink it, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
And like I've seen, in companies too with bureaucracy and like in universities, it's considered a concern maybe that there's so many administrators relative to faculty, and like that just kind of keeps growing and it's like sort of hard to cut it back. So it's kind of a pervasive concern. It's
interesting with social programs though, because a lot of them are very volatile and kind of, we had welfare reform in the 90s and, a lot of programs kind of get changed or reformed or go in and out.
That's fair, yeah.
But there are certain ones that don't.
Right, that's a good point.
Yeah. And I think, we met Bob Hockett, who's from Cornell Law School, and he was talking about the difference between new property and old property. And old property was like real actual stuff, like land, stuff that had kind of traditionally been property that, it's kind of impossible to take away from people because they feel very morally that there's this ownership there. And then new property is stuff like entitlement programs that are easier to take away. But I don't think that's the whole story. Because I think, Social Security is kind of this kind of new property that no one wants it to be taken away. And the same thing with the permanent fund dividend.
I suspect universal health care would also be like that. Like people would be very resistant to it being taken away. I suspect many of these things are things that affect everybody. Like a lot of the programs that are more volatile, I suspect, are the ones that don't affect the majority of people.
Are targeted.
Yeah, exactly. So then it's easy for the majority of people to say like, oh, we don't want to like spend as much on welfare. But when it's going to everybody, people don't want to give it up, is my guess. So like healthcare would be like that too if it were universal.
Yeah.
Already, even with Obamacare, like hasn't it been pretty hard to like roll back, even though it was super controversial.
Yeah.
Like last July, I think it was.
So I think that's another example of something that affected a lot of people, not even everybody.
Yeah, I think that's right. It does. Obamacare does kind of feel a little less secure, though.
Yeah, I think that's right. But also, many people who are wealthy and influential, or just the average person, have health insurance through their company still. So it's not actually like the same as universal healthcare or as like this income that goes to everybody in Alaska.
Right.
So
it doesn't have the universality.
Yeah, it's a weaker thing for that reason, I think.
Have we ever seen examples of universal benefits that we feel have kind of damaged the economy in which they're implemented or the society? Like maybe in socialist, communist countries or something like that.
Yeah, did you mean in our country or in like
I just mean in general. Like what are some good examples of that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's so interesting to me, really more the opposites, like things we all get used to, like the fire department, the police department, libraries, schools, and then like that's accepted, and healthcare isn't, just kind of because one is familiar and the other isn't.
Yeah. That's
not really your question. Yeah, like examples where we thought it was bad. I don't know others as much. Do you know other countries better? Well, you know one other country better than I do.
Because you're from other countries.
Is there anything other? You're from all of them. No. In Turkey, is there anything like a social program that like people felt was costing too much or was like too detrimental, like that was going to everybody? Is that kind of what you're asking?
There are lots of social welfare things.
Mm-hmm.
I can't talk about it for an hour. I mean, most of them wasted money.
Interesting. Yeah.
I
right.
mean, the politicians, they misuse them in order
I see.
to.
Right. Right.
Um, even for them, I think that maybe it will be better if they accumulate all of them and they give them as a UBI. It will be more efficient.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting.
I even thought about making some calculations about if it's would be possible or not.
Right.
But I'm not sure if I can learn the correct
Yeah.
numbers.
Interesting. That's cool. Yeah, I hadn't thought about corruption, but obviously the simpler your program, the harder it is, the fewer opportunities for corruption, right? Or misuse of funds, or
And there is a people they gave up farming when they got this social.
Interesting.
Because they think that it's too hard farming and it doesn't work.
Right.
But
That's what happened in Iran, remember?
Oh yeah, I was gonna. Yeah. Right.
there are lots of other reasons also. It's not only.
Yeah.
The dynamics are so different, so I cannot compare.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Was it around that we were talking about here, where they tried something like a basic income and people didn't like it?
Yeah, I mean, it was unpopular politically.
Right. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're talking. I guess that's an example against what we've just been saying, where like you give a benefit to everybody, and we expect people never want to give it up.
Yeah, it is an interesting counterexample.
Yeah.
It's because the elites in Iran didn't like that the poor didn't want to work for them anymore,
Right.
and so that's why they wanted to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was pretty politically unpopular too, right? For most
like
of the
other
people. Yeah. I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, so that's strange. I don't know the details of why, but I guess we talked about it.
And also, I think it was the oil was crashed around that point, so they couldn't afford it anymore.
Yeah, and I think they had some inflation, so the purchasing power of it kept going down and down. So maybe people started making some connections there between.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the benefit was less, and then it was complicated because there were all these sanctions on Iran too, and a lot of the inflation came from, well, they can't really import stuff anymore, that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know, I was going to say something else, but I don't remember what it was. That's okay. You guys ready for another quote? This is a lot of money. Basically, it means the amount of money that's being paid out. Basically, it means about $2 billion per year and up, flowing out of the Treasury to Alaskans. Only part of this will get into the economy, thanks to people like me who will spend it in Europe. That's the author, not people like me.
I don't know. Sounds like you want to go to Europe, babe.
Well, I'm happy to spend things. I'm happy to spend things in Europe, or spend money in Europe and buy things from them. I don't know if I want to go there. Yeah. But I mean, I think this is a good point about the flow of money. That Alaska is not a closed economy. We live in a global economy now. So if you give money to people, that money is not all going to stay there. It's eventually going to flow away. But this is true of any money that anybody gets from kind of any source.
Yeah.
If you have income from a job or something like that. And I would say that it's true at the level of the global economy too, because consumers get their income and then they spend their money and then it goes to the producers. And so in the case of Alaska and in the case of the global economy, you need a mechanism to get money back into the hands of consumers. And you can't fund something like a basic income sustainably by, taxing the spending that's going on in the economy, because that would be, a perpetual motion machine. So I mean, I think this is a reasonable concern, but it's also it applies to pretty much however you'd spend the money, and it applies to any incomes that people get from anywhere. trying to keep money within an economy, I think is a losing battle, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned this, but even just saving money will like take some of it out.
Yeah, when people save money, it's not circulating as much anymore. And of course, when you save money, that money gets invested, and those investments go somewhere, and the money doesn't move that way, and it moves, like it funds businesses and all that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, you still have to answer the question of, okay, but how is money getting into the hands of consumers? So you can invest money left and right, and it can bop around the financial sector. If there isn't a basic income, or there aren't jobs or something, people aren't gonna get money to spend. Like, just because the money keeps moving and keeps being reinvested or something like that does not mean it's going back to the consumer.
It's not going to trickle down as you will.
It's not going to trickle down. That's
Maybe
a good
it will
way to put it.
trickle down, but
It'll trickle down.
It'll gush up.
Right. The
Trickle
rate at
down.
which it comes back down is not the rate at which it
Why
goes
did
up.
they name it something more appealing, like flow down or something? Trickle doesn't even seem good.
Oh, I've actually heard that if there was this comedian in the 1930s, and who's should trickle down. If money could trickle down to the hands of the poor, but they'll be able to hold on to it for a day before it gushes back up to the rich, where they have it all. And the President Hoover misnamed policy trickle down.
So there was a comedian making fun of the fact that the poor just got a trickle of money, and then President Hoover misinterpreted that joke
That's
and
funny.
named a policy after it. Okay, that's interesting.
That is funny.
So I guess that was a good question for you to be asking.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean,
Will Rogers,
Will Rogers.
who
Okay.
used it derisively to describe President Herbert Hoover's stimulus efforts during the Great Depression.
Yes, I thought so. Yes.
More recently, opponents of President Ronald Reagan used the term to attack his influence.
So it's not that Herbert Hoover got the
I don't
name
know.
from Will Rogers.
I didn't read
It's
the
that
whole
Will Rogers was making fun of Herbert Hoover.
I didn't
Okay.
read the entire thing. That was just like a really quick thing, but
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, this kind of prompts the question of how can the economy of Alaska keep functioning sustainably? How can you make that happen using economic policy? And I don't know that you can. I don't know that it's possible. I think, money's always going to be trickling out, and they can't really issue their own currency. They can borrow, they can issue, municipal bonds or state level debt and stuff like that. But there's limits to that. And, they don't, kind of like Greece in the EU, they don't control their own currency. So,
Right.
so they can't, I think there's a limit. There's a limit to it. And they're going to need help from above. They're going to need help eventually from the federal government. They can't just be a self-contained, self-sustaining economy, because the money is going to keep flowing out. This is true of any state. We're just picking on Alaska now because we're talking about Alaska.
That's actually what happened in ancient Rome. They wanted silk from China, and they got it through the middleman of India because it was closer, and that's how they kept losing all their silver, and so they couldn't sustain their economy very well.
Yeah, it makes if your money's silver, you can't print more silver either. So these kinds of things will keep happening again and again until we have kind of like stable economic policy that keeps money flowing. That keeps money flowing from consumers, and they can make up for it by borrowing at the consumer level, borrowing at the state level. Businesses can borrow. But then all that debt kind of, there's a limit to how much debt you can go into before it gets too fragile.
Yeah. By the way, William Jennings Bryan criticized trickle-down theory in his Cross of Gold speech in 1896.
Did he use the term trickle
He
down?
probably didn't use the term trickle-down. I think that came from
Okay.
the comedian, but he talked about that theory. Kind of
Okay.
thing. Sorry, just thought you might be interested.
Good to know. Yeah, so I mean, to think about, if the Alaskan economy is unsustainable, and it's always going to be unsustainable, asking about how to allocate spending between, the permanent fund and other forms of infrastructure, or the permanent fund dividend and other forms of infrastructure, are we really asking, how to, optimize things on, like something that's going to be failing eventually anyway, because we haven't addressed the overall issue, or the larger issue of where do you get a sustained stream of income for consumers from?
Wait, what's your question?
So my point here is that if there's no sustained stream of income going to consumers, if you're taking some of their spending and giving it back to them, or you're selling oil, I guess
there's money coming in because you're selling oil.
I guess that's a
they
good
mentioned
point.
Automation and taking away jobs in the article, and so
yeah. So I think the oil is a good point. The oil could be part of what actually does keep the Alaskan economy sustainable. Like you've always got a stream of oil going out, so you can always have a stream of money going in.
Yeah, so it doesn't work across the whole globe, but if you happen to be in a place where you can having more money flow to you, then it's sort of trickling down.
there actually was a country called Nauru that sold all their fertilizer because there was a birds stopped over there every year, but then they started like mining their fertilizer, and then they had nothing left, and so all their retirement programs crashed, and so they couldn't do it anymore.
No.
So they had no fertilizer, so they couldn't sell it anymore, and they also couldn't grow any crops or anything.
Mm-hmm. And so they had to beg Australia to buy them out or whatever. And so now they're a stopover for all the immigrants who want to go into Australia.
Huh.
So this is an island?
An island nation.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, so I'm thinking about this oil stream, and I'm thinking about I'm thinking about other countries, or other states being able to do something similar. If there's a natural resource or something that is produced by the state, that can kind of,
I mean, I think this is the intuition behind why people like to have a trade, surplus or whatever, where they're exporting more than they're importing. Like, it's this idea that, like, you need money flowing to you, so you've got to be, like, putting more out there.
No, China could do that with their exports, and that way they can fund their consumer economy that way.
What?
But they're not doing that.
They could do what with their exports?
They can create their own sovereign wealth fund with.
They can have money coming in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess this is kind of the answer for if you don't have monetary authority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess what I was saying is, like, I think this is a well-known answer, and I think it's one that even countries as a whole try to use in some way, or they think about it, at least in political speeches.
Right.
And stuff.
And they're kind of thinking about this even if they do have, even if other countries, I mean, like, so there's the idea that if you're producing a lot and selling a lot to other people, then that's gonna give you income, that's gonna give you money to spend. But then the flip side of that is that if other people kind of perpetually want to sell you stuff for really cheap, and you can print money, you don't have to worry about it, right?
Yeah, but I wasn't talking about that.
I'm talking about it.
Yeah, I mean that's the perspective for if somebody controls their own currency. But I was saying something else.
But tell me what you were saying.
Well, I was just saying that, like, no, it's not. I mean, I said what I was saying. So,
Okay.
like, if you're Alaska, for example,
Right.
you feel you need like a constant inflow of money, and the only way to get that is to have people buy things or whatever, right? So
Right. So I'm trying to generalize this to a larger scale, and I think it applies to. I think that same intuition applies to a country as well. If you are producing things that people want to buy, then they can owe you stuff for that. So when they send you money, that money is IOUs, right, from that country, say, for stuff, right? So the
And
question,
then they can use it to buy, like with China, they can use it to buy assets in your country.
buy assets or just goods from your country or something like that. But here you would be using it. If China's the one buying the stuff from you, you would now have all this Chinese money that you know is good for Chinese stuff. So that's good for you if you trust that China's going to be able to make good on those IOUs.
right, but I
Yeah.
guess I'm confused who it's better for, if that even makes sense as a question.
So I think by and large the trade deficit, if it's sustainable, is better for the country that's getting the stuff and sending the money away, because now you're getting more stuff. But the trade surplus or being able to export stuff represents, that represents your potential to fulfill your obligations to other people. If I'm selling stuff to China, then if I'm actually producing stuff, then they know that the slips of paper they got from me at one point are good for actual stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So in a kind of perfectly balanced trade world, you would imagine that everyone would kind of be importing and exporting roughly the same amount of stuff because you'd be selling stuff for their money, and they'd be selling stuff for your money, and those monies are IOUs from the different countries, and they're backed up by the production of those countries.
So
right?
then how would it factor in that obviously not every country has the same amount of sort of like productive capacity, resources, any of that?
Yeah, so if that's the case, if it really does balance out and people aren't like trying to over export or something like that, then what you would have is that the countries that are able to produce less are proportionally poorer
Right.
than the countries that are able to produce more domestically,
Right.
because they're able to, yeah. So that's kind of how it would shake out. But if you have countries that want to export more than they're getting back in, now everyone else can benefit from that. If that's something that's sustained. So if China wants to keep exporting steel or whatever, now the rest of the world benefits because they don't have to match the exports in the other direction because China wants to kind of overdo it. Yeah.
So I guess the intuition that people have that you should try to maximize your productive capacity, including kind of relative to other countries, isn't wrong. It's just that there happen to be some countries at the moment who are operating in a way that you don't really actually think is that rational.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if all the countries are acting rationally, then they kind of have a more balanced trade relationship with each other, and they're roughly importing and exporting the same amount of value of stuff. And then if they have any excess productive capacity, instead of exporting that away, you would produce that for your own citizens.
Right.
If
So
you care about your own citizens.
I guess what I should
yeah.
say is like your view is that the intuition of people that you should have as much productive capacity as possible is correct, but the intuition that you shouldn't want to take a lot of cheap exports from other people is incorrect.
Particularly if they're subsidizing
right.
their toasters or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like, you want to make as much stuff as possible for your people, and to the extent that trading some of that stuff away for other stuff from other countries, makes you even better off, comparative advantage and all of that, you do that. But that would be kind of the limit. But if you live in a world where you're a rational country and you want to produce as much stuff as possible for your people, and all the other countries want to give you excess stuff, they want to kind of overproduce and over-export, then you win, right? So I think that's, yeah. So in terms of Alaska, I don't think they're necessarily over-exporting. They're exporting however much oil they have, and they're also anticipating
like fish and things as well.
Right. And they're also anticipating running out of oil, maybe not running out of fish if they manage that properly. But they're anticipating running out of oil at some point in the future. So they're kind of like banking up. So they are kind of like over exporting in the present with the hope of using this permanent fund money to kind of over import in the future when they're not able to produce more oil. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
So that was kind of a little side rant there. I was just kind of thinking through that.
Right. Should we go to the next quote?
Yeah. So this is talking about the increase in the amount of the dividend this year after the past few years when it was lower.
Right.
So the difference over the 3 years, when it was lower, amounts to $2.3 billion that would have been paid under the formula, in addition to the $2.4 billion actually appropriated. If this back payment is made, it will amount to a supplemental payment of about $3,700, according to the Office of Management and Budget Calculations. So this $3,700 is on top of the normal oil check that they get. So they normally get $3,000. So at the end of 2019, they could potentially get a check for $6,700.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. So I think I highlighted this one because I was interested in thinking about the different effects on the economy of the sudden jump in consumer spending that this would kind of induce.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we have the money, and it's another thing to throw all that money at an economy all at once. And you can imagine, you could take this to the extreme and, imagine a scenario in which Alaska decides to liquidate the permanent fund and pay everyone, a portion of that. And I don't know how much that would be, but it would be more than $6,700. It would be maybe $100,000 or something like that.
That's what they, when people graduate from high school in Native American reservations, things like that, if they have a casino, they get like $100,000 or something like that.
Wow.
And so these people like fritter it away on their, like it was by a car, and or they will go buy a bunch of drugs, or we could take this vacation along the West Coast for surfing or something like that. And when they could just invest that and they never have to work again or something.
Yeah, so that's just like a few people who are graduating high school in kind of a smallish community. Imagine that's everybody in the state of Alaska all at once, and what that would do to the economy. I mean, technically you kind of have the money, but that doesn't mean that the Alaskan economy has the capacity to handle that demand.
Do you think it doesn't have the capacity to handle this, though?
To handle this amount here?
Yeah.
I think it probably does. I think you'd see some stimulus. You'd see, obviously they import stuff already, and it is a global economy, so a lot of the consumer demand will, if it's too much for the local store.
I believe there's like 800,000 people in Alaska,
yeah.
And for the 4,000 people in the Ottawa program is going to end at the end of the month.
Ontario,
it cost $150 million. So, how much would it's like 17,000 Canadian dollars per person, so that's like $14,000 in American funds. And see,
I don't think it's quite that much. The Canadian dollar half of a United States dollar.
What? Is it?
No, it's
you said 17,000, 14,000. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
so if you do 800,000 times 14,000, that would be about 2 point whatever millions. I think that 2.3 million is
billion.
It includes like the budget for the state or something like that too. I'm not sure.
I think this is just the dividend. So this is 2.3 billion divided by 800,000-ish people.
At the beginning of the article, it
Yeah,
said
so that makes sense. It would be about 3,000, right? Because 3 times 8 is 24. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is going to be a bump in consumer spending, and the fact that it happens all at once is an interesting thing.
That is.
I'd be interested to know what some of the effects are of, the fact that everybody gets this at the same time of year. Like, do businesses plan for that? Are there like special
Right.
things going on at this time of year where businesses try to make money and cash in on the fact that everyone has more money to spend, and
That's a good
that
point.
kind of thing?
It's kind of like how there's some towns, like if they're like vacation towns, they make like a whole bunch of money in the summer or something like
Right.
that. And so, or like
Like
the Christmas season.
Yeah, like in Mystic, Connecticut, which is nearby where I used to live, they raised gas prices like 50 cents per gallon or something like that, right
Wow.
around the time where people are traveling there.
Wow. Yeah.
This is the aquarium and things like, and the seaport, which are big tourist attractions. Out
Yeah, I've seen them.
Yeah.
So like I guess Christmas is already kind of like this, like, and so companies plan for it and they have more inventory and stuff. So it would make sense.
Actually, all holidays are like that. There's
Right.
big consumer, like they have Halloween decorations out in like August or something like that, or
Right.
Yeah. So I wonder if dividend day is a little bit like that in
Yeah, I was
Alaska.
thinking that. Like people spend, like, probably do something like pricey, like go out to dinner or something when they get it and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the case for like tax refunds? But it's not everybody gets a refund, and it's all different sizes. So
Yeah, that's a good point. Not everybody gets a refund, but they do all get it at the same, or maybe they don't all get it at the same time. They kind of trickle in.
oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's actually curious. Like, I don't know if everybody gets their permanent fund dividend check at
Right,
the same
or if
time.
it
They
kinda
might just trickle
trickles
in too.
But they could be kind of like the holiday season, like around December, like
yeah.
a month where people are getting a lot of
But
money.
yeah, actually, it does trickle in. The article that I posted on the meetup, they said that they were waiting for their dividend for like 2 months.
Interesting.
Okay.
That's interesting.
So that would kind of lessen the effect.
Right.
And I think the tax returns trickle in. It's even more of a trickle because it kind of depends on when you filed your return too, and there's like a large window there.
Because people get their like their thing from their stockbroker or whatever in like the end of January, and other people and so they file their taxes then, and other people wait until April 15th, the last day to file taxes.
Right.
And some people wait. Want an extension, so they're able to file it. What was it, like August or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe it's. I mean, I still think well. Yeah. I mean, I think the bumping the dividend up to $6,700 from the previous year when it was like $1,700 or something like that would make a difference in the economy there. Be interesting to see how, what happens.
Yeah. My sense, like you, is that the spending is like so diffuse. I mean, Alaska is more isolated than Massachusetts, but there's so much of my money that I don't spend in Massachusetts.
Right. Like
I mean,
ordering stuff on Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I go to the stores around here and stuff sometimes, or like the cafes, but most of it's Amazon.
Yeah.
Or travel elsewhere, or.
Yeah.
But I don't know. In Alaska, it's harder to ship things, so I don't know if people use those things as much.
Like they had there's a Blockbuster. They actually had Blockbuster still, and that's
really? Oh wow.
And that it just the one they just like. John Oliver, he bought all this stuff from Russell Crowe so that people would visit the Blockbuster, but the last Blockbuster closed up there recently, and so they shipped it down to Oregon or something like that.
That's funny.
Because that's the last one in the entire country.
Oh wow!
There's one in Oregon still going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's because they didn't have all the internet and things from Netflix, and that's why they were still viable.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool.
still thinking about the sustainability of the oil coming or the oil going out and being able to pay the money. I think that is something that's sustainable as long as the oil keeps going.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
But doesn't that mean that, like, on average, somewhere else, like, there's even more money flowing out?
Unless the United States is being smart and adequately supplying the economy with money.
Oh, and the oil is being sold to the rest of the U.S. or something.
Yeah, or the rest of the world is being smart about issuing enough currency and that kind of thing, which I don't think they are, and I think what you end up seeing is a lot of spending being funded by borrowing in the private sector.
Or like you would talk about this with the EU.
Yeah.
Like some countries are net money flowing out, some countries are net money flowing in, and like that creates a problem for the countries that are net money flowing out and they don't control their own currency within the EU.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like a similar thing. Like
so like Germany might be sustainable as long as everyone's buying German cars and other products and stuff like that. And Alaska might be sustainable as long as everybody's buying their oil. But if the market for those cars or the market for that oil collapses, then obviously Alaska and Germany are in trouble. Yeah. Like if the price of oil, like, we saw what happened with Venezuela when the price of oil crashed. And obviously there were some variables that were very different in Venezuela as compared to Alaska. But yeah, nothing I guess is certain if you're depending on something like this.
Right.
Yeah. Let's go on to another quote. However the dynamic between the permanent fund dividend and public services plays out, a larger dividend is an interesting experiment in guaranteed income, which some social scientists and economists in other states and countries see as a solution to structural economic changes, such as loss of good-paying jobs to automation and artificial intelligence. So, to what extent, like, what are we going to be able to learn from? I mean, this was kind of the question I started with, but what are we going to be able to learn from, a higher dividend in Alaska that we can apply to, the conversation about universal basic income in general?
Everybody seems so interested in how it affects addiction.
How it affects addiction.
Like, you're not necessarily that interested in it, but a lot of people are. And I guess I have to say that, like, you could learn a little bit about it from that, maybe. I mean, that's an interesting question, because, like, it's not maybe enough to live on, and it's not, so I guess, like, and you don't know if it's going to stay high forever or something like that, so it could be a little bit different. But at the same time, like, it's a stigma-free increase in income, and so you could see if that decreases addiction, increases addiction. Even this guy mentions addiction. I mean, everybody seems to have to mention addiction. Yeah. As a possible downside. So, but it might be a possible upside, as you pointed out too. Like addiction might go down. So, I suppose you could see what happened there.
Yeah. It's weird because I think about a default world in which everyone's getting, a basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy.
It actually went down in Kenya with the give directly basic income,
addiction and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's not surprising, but
people feel they have more control of their lives, so they're better able to manage their resources and things.
Yeah.
Well, like, there's statistics like the fact I've heard or I read that drug use is similar across socioeconomic status in the U.S., but drug addiction is higher among low socioeconomic status. So it's kind of related to that argument that you have less going on in your life that you want to stay sober for, basically. Right.
So, like I was saying on this topic, I think about kind of a default world in which everybody's getting a basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy. So there aren't really, in this scenario, any poor people or anything like that. So then the question is, if people are suffering from addiction or spending their money in ways that are harmful to themselves, how do we address that? And when you look at it from that kind of point of view, the question is, do you take away their money, or do you do something else, or do you restrict them in some other way, or something like that? And I think this is kind of like a more general.
It's more like it's like SNAP, and you're not allowed to buy certain things.
Right. But like so the question is, if everybody has money, including rich people, and everybody's rich, and some people are getting addicted, or some people are struggling with addiction, then how do you help them? Do you monitor their money? Do you make it so they can only buy food with their money? And really, why would you want it to be just the money from the basic income, or just the money from the government? That's kind of restricted in this way.
I'm not like saying this is the question that I would most want to know, but it's a question that a lot of people want to know, and it doesn't even you don't even have to think about it as a basic income exactly, but you're control, like you're adding income to everybody in the state, and you can see if that affects this question that people are really interested in.
You can have but other people. If you can legalize all those drugs at like Portugal, and then use and tax that funds, and then put it into rehabilitation programs.
Yeah,
just have it like a sin tax or whatever they call it.
So Portugal is a very good example of
and people in states that countries that legalize it, the drugs become less cool, so the consumption actually goes down.
Yeah, I think I don't know if that would have that much of an effect on addiction as much as it would on just drug use in general, right? Because people who are addicted aren't using it because it's cool anymore usually, right?
Oh, the coolness thing.
Yeah.
No, I guess people have to get addicted somehow.
So maybe they got addicted because they thought it was cool.
I don't know. I don't know those data.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's what they have. How cigarettes were really popular up until the 90s. Because it was all the movie stars were smoking and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different things. Like you have more safety and regulation and stuff like that too. Being able to, people, the culture around it could become more responsible.
Yeah.
Which could make a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of things.
And I think you're right that this is a big question that people often ask with basic income is, well, is that going to fuel people's addictions? Are they going to spend it on drugs and alcohol and that kind of thing?
Right. And I agree with you. Like, I don't think that the solution to that is to not give people a basic income so that some people don't increase their addiction. But nevertheless, people are interested in that, and I guess you could try to find something out about it.
Yeah, I mean, you could find something out about it. I guess I'm just generally frustrated that this is the question people are asking, because I don't think it's the right question to be asking.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a little bit tricky for me to think of things that you can find out from this that would kind of scale up. I think the question about when people get something like this, do they start to see it as an entitlement and become resistant to losing it, and it becomes less controversial? That seems like something that might be applicable broadly, that we've kind of already seen from the Alaska thing, but.
Yeah, and I think also if they observe kind of the stimulus to the economy, which I think they have, they compare okay, well, people are receiving this dividend now. If they weren't, then there would be all this much less consumer spending and stuff like that. And they talk about
there's also they have they say more part-time jobs because of the dividend.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I think I think that could be another thing that people see. So observing the effect of, this really does stimulate the economy and allow us to produce more stuff for people, that might get people's gears turning and think about, this really is kind of the effect of basic income, and this is what it's for, and the fact that we were able to do this with our economy, showed that there was kind of this untapped potential there.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll get some people thinking about, maybe this is what basic income is for. I think this, in particular, gives us more information than the Finland experiment or the Ontario experiment, where it's only a subset of people who are getting it, and you don't see kind of this macroeconomic effect.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it's a broader kind of group of people, and also I was thinking it's more predictable and enduring. So with the part-time jobs, people could actually take a part-time job expecting some of this money to keep coming. Whereas like a lot of the experiments, you kind of know they're going to end, so you can't necessarily change those things as
Right.
much. So that seems useful as a way to, like something that you can kind of think about that's different about this one from the others.
Yeah.
Likewise, I'd be interested if it changes people's political attitudes. Like, are people less resistant?
Like they said at the beginning in 1982 that people are far more conservative than they are now.
Right, so that could be interesting. Yeah, and I was actually wondering also, well, you've raised the question of like, I don't know if this is large enough or not, but you raised the question of like hostility towards other groups or different things. Some people are like more or less strapped themselves.
Yeah.
This is a relatively small amount of money to affect something like that, but maybe. I was also thinking specifically people's political attitudes towards things like automation, like just having a precedent of something like a basic income. Do people then imagine like, oh, like eventually that could get bigger, and so like I'm not so worried?
Yeah. How do we get people to start thinking of destroying jobs is a good thing or eliminating jobs is a good thing?
I guess I wonder if this moves people in that direction at all, because they're like thinking, because it's something that could scale up, and it's something where the government takes profit and like gives it back to the people. So is it easier for Alaskans to think about, jobs being taken by robots? Then maybe you just add that to this fund, and then I get that money too, and like now I'm not so worried about self-driving cars or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if it changes people's mindsets like that there, but that would be another interesting thing.
Yeah.
To learn from it.
Okay.
Any other thoughts, Sultan? I don't know.
You guys,
I don't know what to do.
you guys ready for another quote?
I'm ready.
All right. We might actually get through all the quotes today.
I know.
It's going to be a miracle.
Yeah, there's a few people.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
It might also reach the level where it will begin attracting people to move to Alaska just to get the guaranteed income, particularly if the national economy dips. I'm not sure what the PFD amount, permanent fund dividend amount, has to do with this. But
Has to be a dude.
or it has to be to do this, but at some point it will happen. I'm not sure these are the kind of future Alaskans we want.
Yeah. So this is like immigration questions that we've asked before.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I noticed this.
so the question is, why not?
Well, I think we were talking about this recently.
Yeah.
And we were saying that if people are moving for an economic advantage, they don't necessarily like your culture at all, actually. So that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I don't like to be too hostile towards people moving, but like all else being equal, it would be nice for the reason to move to a particular place to be more associated with the characteristics of that place. So people are kind of moving where they fit or where they like the culture or something like that. As opposed to like there's a special economic advantage, and so even if you hate the culture of Alaska, you move there. Like they don't want me moving there with even though I'd rather be in Boston just because I need like this money, because now I'm just gonna be a different cultural thing and not like what they already have going on.
If enough people move there, the culture will change.
Right, and then that's not what the people exist there right now want to have happen, right? So
Do you think it's just that he's worried about random people with other cultures moving in, or are you worried that when he says
if there's enough people there, the amount will go down?
that's true too.
That's not what I was going to say.
Good point.
I was going to say, do you think he's worried that when he says the kinds of future Alaskans we want, is he saying people who are only coming to take rather than to contribute or something like that?
Oh, so like I thought of this in a cultural sense, but you're right.
Yeah.
The more straightforward interpretation would just be like you've got the poorest people moving there.
Or the
Homeless
laziest
people or something.
Oh, I would just think the most straightforward would be the poorest, because that's the first people who are going to move somewhere because of the relatively small amount of money, or any amount of money. And there's all sorts of reasons people might be concerned about that. Yeah.
I mean, if they move there only for the money, then I think he's implying laziness.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like they're
I
only
didn't
coming
get
for
that.
the money. They're not coming to contribute. They're not coming to like do
Oh.
anything constructive or productive. Yeah, I think that's what he.
You think that's
That's-
more than like just like the fact that when people don't have as much money, they often are more likely to commit crime or more likely to have different kinds of problems?
Well, they're going to
and more
have
likely-
some money, right? Because they're going to have the dividend.
Well, right, but like, who's the first person to move when the dividend hits 6,000 or 7,000? I mean, that's not a lot of money, right?
I mean, I think it's poorer people.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's bad personally, but I'm saying that might be what he was saying.
I'm saying that I think it is poorer people who would move. I think there's this mindset among some people that people are poor because they're lazy, and
Maybe.
they're coming, if they're coming only for the money, that implies that they're coming to take, right? I mean, like, I really do think this is the straightforward framing of what he's saying.
Could be. I don't know. Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's needed. Like, I think just the fact that the first people who move are going to be poor is enough.
You think he's worried about, like, poor people committing crimes?
There are all sorts of things, unfortunately, like, associated with, like, pick your thing. Do you want people who are well educated? Do you want people who have savings so that they're more secure?
The
Do you
thing
want
is,
people who
the
don't
only
commit crimes?
the only people who would move here would be the people who move to Alaska,
Right.
would be the people who once they get there, they're not going to be as poor anymore, right?
As poor,
Sure.
I mean, they're less poor than they were before. That doesn't mean they're not poor relative to the other Alaskans.
It's keeping up with the Joneses thing. People would want to work if they to be so they can have the house or whatever the other Alaskans have.
What do you mean?
They're
So you're saying
they're
that-
jealous of the other Alaskans, so they want to try to be like them.
The people who move there?
Mm-hmm.
So you're thinking that once they move there, they might only have this dividend, which is not a lot of money, but they will be motivated to earn more money.
And they'll actually have boots so they're able to pull themselves up by them.
They'll have
Their boots, they're able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if you will, because they actually have boots to pull themselves up by.
like literal boots, or what do you?
The
Or
money.
you mean
He's talking about
the
money.
dividend? Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean,
yeah.
I guess, like, I don't. Maybe this isn't such an important, distinguishing thing. Like, what was your point with the quote, or like, what did you want to talk about with it?
Yeah. So I mean, I think even when you have something like this dividend, or even when people have a basic income, I think there's still this expectation that people should be working and contributing to society, and you don't want the people who aren't participating in that way, who aren't pulling their weight. And I think that's true even when people are thinking in the context of a basic income. So I think that's why I selected this quote. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I just feel like there's a lot of other ways to interpret it. But yeah, I guess you might be right. I mean, there's also pulling your weight in other ways. Like, maybe, I don't necessarily think this is true, but maybe he's concerned they wouldn't volunteer for the PTA, or like help do other kinds of volunteer things, or cultural things. There's not just job
Because
stuff.
they're just not indoctrinated in the
Yeah,
culture?
they're
or-
outside of the culture. For any reason, it could be because they're outside of the culture. It could be because they're poorer on average, which means you have fewer, you have less free time. You have fewer resources to, it's a bit of a catch-22 when you don't have a lot of money. Like, you aren't able to ingratiate yourself as much with giving time and money generously and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How many people live in Alaska?
800,000.
800,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's small.
Yeah.
And it's a big state, so it's kind of spread out.
Yeah.
Although it's really cold in parts, so I think people are concentrated towards the south.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Alaska's really cold. Yeah. Did you know that? Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to assume whatever you know or don't know about.
Maybe this would be this for people.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons more people don't already move there. It's because it's really far, it's really cold, so there's those kinds of barriers to it. But I guess his point is if it got enough to be enough money.
But actually, in recent years, it's been warmer. It's been like the 80 degrees and things like that up there in the winter.
In the winter?
In the winter?
Mm-hmm.
That's warmer than
What?
here.
How?
Yeah, it's because the polar vortex has been going down because of climate change.
Huh. 80
Winter.
degrees in the
You looking that up?
Yeah,
The
I don't know, my
economy is
computer
based
died.
on oil, right? Oil and seafood, maybe. That's it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
tourism. It's really pretty there. There's national parks and stuff.
Lots of cruises
So they
and
have
stuff.
a lot of cruises that go up there, and I guess probably more in the summer, but
Yeah.
things like that. And I'm
And
sure
the
they
jet
have other
streams have
things.
been going down to the cold temperatures have been going down to like
Interesting.
they had like a big deal about it's negative 40 degrees in Chicago and things like that
Right.
just like a month ago.
Wow.
Yeah. All right.
So you wanted to point out like the ideology of feeling like people need to work and contribute.
The ideology of feeling like people need to work. You don't want to just all the people who are kind of want to be takers rather than makers. You don't want them all moving to your place and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's reasonable. But
Yeah.
yeah, I guess that could be what he meant. I guess I just don't know. There's a lot of different things
Yeah.
that come to mind for me, but could have been that.
Let's do another one.
The last one.
The last one. So this is talking about Governor Hammond, who was the governor when they were putting this into place. And it said, interestingly, Hammond supported a much larger dividend, but also one linked to a personal income tax. I often heard him say he wouldn't mind if the bulk of the fund earnings were distributed, but with the revenue for public services clawed back from the public through an income tax.
That's interesting.
So yeah, this is what you were talking about, Bethany, where you kind of separate the concerns of providing everyone with a stigma-free, payout that everyone gets, but then also, an income tax that the people who don't really need it end up paying more back into the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I always think that's a smart way to look at it.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah.
if the taxes are going to be complicated, you don't need to make the payout complicated.
Right.
And if the payouts are
Exactly.
complicated, you don't need to make the taxes complicated.
Yeah. And I think
yeah,
the taxes are already complicated, so we might there's already that
you
precedent.
might as well keep it all over there and just have
Yeah,
a
exactly.
simple
Plus, I
payout.
suspect
Yeah.
if your income is coming, especially regularly, it's easier to have that be an uncomplicated thing, and then.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, in terms of the bureaucracy, if they get it wrong and someone doesn't get paid the money they should get paid, that's worse for
Right.
the people than if they get it wrong and then someone doesn't pay a tax that they should have paid, right? And it also creates an incentive where if you're the government and you want to make sure that you get all your taxes collected, you have an incentive to get it right. Whereas if you're the government and getting it wrong means you actually get to keep some extra money, you don't have to pay out as much, then the incentives are in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Continue on with the next quote. Hammond's notion may be our future if the Governor Dunleavy and the legislature follow through with larger PFDs. Given the limits on our state revenues, we may get to Hammond's idea of a tax sooner than we think.
Yeah. So even if they're not paying out, the full amount, it's still, if you're trying to balance your budget and you're not able to do it and that kind of thing, the tax might be there, or the tax might be inevitable. And if people, some people might frame that as you're increasing taxes instead of taking dividend money away to kind of fill in that gap. So as that's the choice that you're making. Yeah. Yeah. So Tim Bradner, he wrote this.
Editor of the Alaska Legislative Digest.
Yep. And he's visiting Atwood Professor of Journalism at University of Alaska, Anchorage.
Cool.
Yeah.
I dated someone from Alaska.
I dated someone from Alaska.
What? Did we date the same person?
I don't know.
Was yours named Luke?
Nope.
Ah, no, we didn't. No, I'm just kidding. There are enough people from Alaska that it wouldn't have to be the same person.
Yeah.
So that was interesting because there was a lot, I guess the reason I bring it up is there was a strong sense of cultural identity, kind of because they're far away, from everyone else, and it was kind of a thing.
You're saying from Luke?
From this guy, yeah. I don't know if your partner had the same.
Oh, she was definitely rah rah Alaska, talking about
Right.
it all the time. Yeah.
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 So I guess that relates more to your other quote about who moves in, and there's a sense of culture that people want to preserve.
Okay. I guess Mitchell tried to look up the Alaska temperatures. He was unable to
right.
verify, but maybe it's true in some places locally near the
Right.
ocean.
Right.
It's
Thanks,
also
Mitchell.
with native communities, they have to move because their permafrost is melting and they're falling into the sea, so they have to move farther inland with it.
So it's falling into the sea and they're getting like erosion and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Nice.
Well, Alaska's pretty big. I can imagine that, climate change takes its course. A lot of us are going to be moving there. Can get an oil dividend. Yeah.
They don't want us. It's gonna ruin their culture.
Yeah.
Is it bigger than Australia, the continent?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's a really good question. I
think it's
so.
larger than Texas.
3 times the size of Texas.
Wow.
3 times the size of Texas. That's pretty
3
big.
times?
Yeah.
And Texas is as large as France.
Huh.
Alaska versus.
Yeah,
Really?
so
Mhm.
largest in US.
Wow. As large as France.
Alaska.
No, Texas is as large as France. So Alaska's 3 times the size of France.
Australia is 5 times the size of Alaska.
Yeah, this is my point. Texas
yeah.
also has same surface size in Turkey.
Oh, really?
Turkey has 80 million people.
Wow,
so
yeah.
we can fit at least
Yeah, right. At least 80
at
million.
least another USA in there.
Yeah, right. So you could fit at least 3 times that in Alaska, yeah.
Wow.
But that would change the culture there, so they probably. But yes, that's right. It's huge. It's big.
So how do we feel about the fact that people like Andrew Yang point to Alaska as an example of a basic income that's working?
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that on the one hand, something that's familiar helps something be a bit more grounded as a thing to consider, as opposed to seeming like crazy or really out there or who no one would do this or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I guess something I would expect you to be really unhappy with is that it definitely seems to tie it to this model, which Andrew Yang also uses, of like you have some resource and you're kind of taxing that or using that to fund the basic income, and that makes it also feel more grounded to people because they feel like it's based in something, right?
Right.
And so I think that's interesting and not a coincidence that Andrew Yang's trying to frame it like that.
Yeah. And he says technology is the oil of the 21st century.
Yeah,
It's
clever.
I think it's clever. I don't know if it quite
I thought he
fits.
said data was the oil of the 21st century.
I don't think so.
Technology is
the
Well,
data.
in the State of the Union address, State of the State address, the governor of California wants to tax data.
Good luck to him. I don't know how you're gonna do that. I don't know. I don't even know like what it would mean to tax data. How do you what is 1 unit of data? And
They can use unit as like how many people's data they use, not how many terabyte or something, but how many people.
They want to create a data dividend with how many people. And it's sort of like a sovereign wealth fund out of data.
Sounds like a terrible idea.
So I
Yeah,
think
I agree.
Yeah.
I think something also that this kind of framing accomplishes, including the Alaska comparison, is that it takes people out of the mindset of like, oh, people are getting paid for things they didn't earn and that's bad, and into the mindset of, oh, this is a normal thing that people get like these dividends from things that they should consider public resources.
Right.
Like
So
the
Norway's
commons,
like that too, yeah.
exploiting the commons.
Mm-hmm. So it really affects the appeal, and for that reason too, I think the comparison to Alaska kind of makes it more appealing because.
Yeah, if it's something you deserve.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we don't associate. I think it also helps that we don't associate Alaskans with being like super liberal. That's correct, right? They're like a red state, I think. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They had Sarah,
Palin.
and
Sarah
stuff.
Palin. Yeah.
So they're not very liberal Alaskans. So the fact that that's true also affects, I think, the way that this comparison lands. It's like
Right.
if even conservatives would do this, then like it must not be so out there, kind of thing.
Yeah. Andrew Yang
Yeah.
says Alaska is a deeply conservative state, and they did it. So
Right.
why can't the
Right.
rest of the country? And I think that's a
Exactly.
little bit disingenuous because obviously the politics in Alaska were complicated at the time, and
Yeah.
the conservatives were kind of not for this wasn't like a conservative
Yeah.
pushed idea, even though it was enacted under a conservative governor.
But I
or
think
a
we
Republican
draw a
governor,
lot
yeah.
of
that Senator Gravel, did they mention the article?
Yeah.
He was a Democrat.
Right.
But never. Go ahead. Did you want
He
to
was
say
the
more?
first. He was elected in 1960, right when this first acquired statehood.
Oh,
He was a carpetbagger. He moved up there just so he could become a senator.
that's funny. But even if it was complicated, the people still approve it, and
Right.
now it's popular, and now those people are conservative. So it changes how it seems. I mean, people infer things from like what kinds of people would support it, and people are just
Yeah.
very partisan too. So like if they think the opposite side supports something and their side doesn't, they're more likely to be opposed to it too. So
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I think all of those things come into play there. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't feel like a welfare program if you compare it to Alaska. Like Alaska's program oddly doesn't feel like a welfare program. Partly
Right.
because it goes to everyone, but also partly because it's a conservative state. Somehow that changes whether it feels like a welfare program
Yeah.
versus something people deserve. Because basic income goes to everyone too, but people still kind of frame it as a welfare program.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's also true that a lot of the basic income advocates frame it as a safety net or
Right.
like a more efficient welfare program or
Right.
something like that, rather than kind of like this fundamental piece of infrastructure that's
Yeah.
necessary for the economy and
Yeah.
that everybody deserves.
Well, I feel like
Um,
Alaska doesn't frame it that way either, do they? Like as a fundamental infrastructure piece.
I don't think they do. I mean, I think there are people who do talk about how it helps sustain the consumer economy in Alaska, by giving it that little bump of
Right.
spending. But they don't frame it centrally as that.
I
It's
wonder
more.
how the health outcomes are in the mental health and things like
Yeah,
that.
that would be cool to know.
If they're better just for $3,000 or whatever dollars, imagine a full basic income of $12,000 or more.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's,
That's interesting.
as with anything in at the macroeconomic level, it's hard to run like a study of these things because you can't ever get the counterfactual. There's not
Yeah.
like another Alaska
I
somewhere
know.
that doesn't have an oil dividend.
But like it could be interesting to
they're
see.
actually there's some sort of analysis where they combine all these states with a certain population and combine them into the equal in Alaska, and that's how they compare them.
Okay. Do you know anything about what they've learned?
I read an article about that like a year ago. I don't really remember it.
Okay.
I was going to say, like, with the bump in income, you could look at that. I mean, it is confounded with time, but it's all happening in 1 year. Although it's not sustainable, so I don't know how much effect it would have on health.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that.
So it's So I've just highlighted another quote from the
Yeah,
article.
right.
Unless you had something you
No,
want to say.
that's fine.
Okay. So, however, many of us around then also remember Hammond having reservations about a government handout. He searched for alternative ideas, including a state resource corporation, with citizens having shares and receiving dividends from earnings of the corporation.
Right.
So it's almost like it sounds like it's something that the end result would be something that's very similar, but it's more explicit that it shares in a corporation and it's a more
right.
explicit dividend in kind of like the traditional sense.
Yeah. That's
So it's kind of
interesting.
like this reframing thing again.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
It's also interesting as I reflect upon this that like we don't tend to have a problem in the American narrative. Well, some people do, but a lot of people don't have a problem with people earning money from their stocks or like dividends or whatever, even though they're not necessarily like working for that actively.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you can then do that reframing and just think of it that way, and it seems somehow legitimate.
Right.
Whereas otherwise it seems like a handout. So it's like seems like it's sort of a matter of framing kind of what people own or not.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like free money anymore.
Right.
Actually, people pay 15% tax or 21% versus 35% for people who actually work.
What do you mean?
Capital dividends versus.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't feel like free money anymore.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, this proposal here where he's talking about giving people shares in a state resource corporation. Well, you don't have a government handout of money, but you have a government handout of shares.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just kind of like one step of
Right.
abstraction further removed from handing out money. But
Yeah.
it's still a handout.
But it kind of points to this ambiguity about like what do we own collectively?
Right.
Because then that just seems to change kind of almost just based on what people are used to, like we were talking about with like
Right.
certain things we expect, like roads, we expect like we all own them and the government should provide
Those roads are
them
just a
and-
handout.
Yeah, but we don't
Yeah.
think of them as like just a handout or whatever.
Yeah, and-
but like yeah, exactly.
And right, is the military a handout or
Right,
yeah, or
exactly.
is
We don't
schools a
think of
handout?
that,
Yeah.
and we don't. And schools probably were controversial when they first happened.
Yep.
We don't think of those as a handout. So it's like a bit arbitrary. It kind of seems like, and I guess that's what you can use.
Actually,
as
the
a
first
sort of-
public schools were started by there was a Christian, Protestant and a Catholic, and so they wanted to teach Bible studies or whatever.
Right.
And they the Catholic wanted to have it interpreted, and the Protestant didn't want to, and so they agreed. They agreed to just have the Bible study, and then they have the people interpret that, and that's how. And so for like 150 years up until they outlawed that, or the Supreme Court, they actually they didn't have the interpretation or anything like that.
They just read the Bible. You know?
So just they read the Bible and just
Have their prayer time or whatever.
okay. Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. I guess religion has often been a motive to educate people.
Yeah. So
Yeah, but there's actually the countries that didn't have, they had their, the Catholic countries, and they have their Latin Bibles were actually less developed than the Protestant countries with the Bible in their native language.
because they could actually read it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So let's get people's final thoughts on Alaska.
I really like this discussion. I thought of some things I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah.
I guess some of the points that stand out to me are this. I guess these political points really, like how do people frame things, and like when something becomes normalized, how does that change the framing and the expectation and the attachment to it?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And Alaska kind of highlights a lot of those factors.
Yeah.
And like they kind of have this identity of like we're Alaskans, and so we have this resource that's ours. And I guess I also wonder if the diversity of groups and so on in the rest of the country makes it harder as well to have that kind of framing. Because a lot of times people are saying handout, but what they really maybe are feeling is like we don't want that other group to get that handout. And so if you feel like kind of all one group, and Alaska's small and
Homogeneous.
more homogeneous, similarly Norway is, like are these places that are smaller and more, not as small, but more homogeneous? Anyway, forget Norway, but are these places that are more homogeneous and smaller, is it easier to have this framing of like we own this resource together, we all get this kind of contribution from it,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
But I will pass.
Richard?
What, as Bethany was saying, countries that are more homogeneous are more likely to support generous handouts to other countries, like the Nordic countries. They have although they accept more like Syrians and things like that, than say the U.S. They, through their homogeneity, they have all these generous benefits and things like that, and oh, I forgot where I was going with that.
That's okay.
That's okay. Any final thoughts about Alaska? All right. That's fine. Yeah, so I mean, the Alaska example comes up a ton. And I don't know, it bothers me when people point to Alaska and say that's a basic income just because of how I think about basic income and how far away that is from,
It's like a fourth of what a basic income would be.
Not just the amount, but in terms of conceptually what a basic income is and what it's for. Like, so the amount, the amount being determined by, where you're getting the money from instead of, what can the economy handle, and then, the payout being once a year and the amount being inconsistent from year to year, and just in terms of what they're thinking about it being for, like they frame it as, people deserve it because they own the oil in the ground, whereas for me it's, people deserve money because they're people and we can afford to give it to them. And I don't think I think when you point at something like Alaska, it can bring up objections that wouldn't apply to a basic income that's calibrated to the economy's capacity and that kind of thing. Like someone might say, oh, look, there's a basic income in Alaska, and then the next person might say, yeah, but they have the oil, and technology isn't really oil, and it's not like something that the state owns that they're exporting, that they're distributing to people, and that kind of thing. Or they might argue, yeah, well, is the money being distributed efficiently if we put some of it into a dividend that goes to all the people? And those types of questions can kind of derail the basic income discussion, but it also gets more people talking. And if you point to something real in the real world, then maybe that's useful. Maybe that helps bring the discussion along, and maybe we need to kind of move through that process, because people aren't going to understand everything all at once, but they can look to something real and say, okay, maybe this isn't like fantasy utopia vision or whatever. So yeah, great discussion.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Next week we're going to talk about international trade. So we got a little bit of preview of that when we talked about the exporting of the oil and all of that, but there's more to come next week. So thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mitchell, too, for being on the live stream.